or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome today to this session. This is the second session that we're doing with Tom in his Entreprenova webcast. So we've been very much looking forward to sharing today with you about MVPs. So for those of you who for whom it is the first time to connect, let's quickly introduce ourselves. Do you want to start, Tom?
Sure. I'm Tom Clement. I am an assistant professor of management and entrepreneurship at Minnesota State University, Mankato, which is about an hour south of the Twin Cities in the United States. And Inga, my co-host, go ahead and take it away.
Yes. So I have been working with entrepreneurship, both with entrepreneurs in a very big accelerator program, mainly in Colombia, and entrepreneurship education for a long time, meanwhile. And I have created from that experience a game called the Playground for Entrepreneurs, which is really a serious game, a coaching tool for coaches and for educators. So let's get started. Today we are going to talk about MVPs and the sense and nonsense of MVPs, because there's a lot of talk about that. By the way, please introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us where you're connecting from. We always like to see who's there and who's listening, and if you have any questions. So back to the MVPs. We were just talking about how the creation of an event and the audience of an event on LinkedIn is such a good metaphor for MVPs, really, because
We were
the
having a
invitations.
little laugh about that before we went live. You know, you think about a minimum viable product and you create an event like this, like the Entreprenova webcast, and you put the invitation out there. It's really easy to see somebody's name and say, you know, I'm familiar with them and I'm just going to click attend. But then actually attending the event, making the commitment to take the time out of your schedule to actually attend, that's oftentimes why the numbers are so different between who says they will attend and who actually shows up to attend. There's a
Yes,
lot of correlation there to what you talk about when you think about an MVP.
definitely, because with an MVP, it's really an experiment of knowing your audience, of seeing how you can get to this audience, how you can access to their interest, and finally their wallets also. Who is willing to make that investment? Well, for a LinkedIn event, obviously that's time, right? That's not money, but it's time. But for an MVP, very often that is money, actually putting money on the table to receive something that's probably not even finished yet, but showing your interest, and not only showing it, but actually making that commitment.
Right. And I first heard the term, you know, minimum viable product back right around the time lean startups started to get popular. You started hearing that term being used, and it was a tough term to define at first. I think a lot of people assume it's sort of a buggy, not so great working product that you just throw out there to try to see if people are willing to commit to it. And you know, what I've sort of come up with for a definition, at least that I use with my students in class, is what is the least we can offer right now that will cause a customer commitment of some kind, and usually that is in the form of money. You know, what can we do to encourage the customer to give us their money in exchange for some sort of minimum product that we can offer to them?
And that's actually where I see it very often going wrong, because people think it's just a crappy product, right? A mediocre
Right.
product, something you throw together and kind of get the interest and make a cool sales pitch and everything and the slogan for it. That's not it. It's something that usually solves only one thing, but it does it very well. It might not have a great interface. It might not look good. It might not have all the features that you want to incorporate for it, but it does something really well. That's one thing it does very well, and that happens to be the headache of your customer.
And
That's
MVPs are not prototyping either. We've had this discussion, you and I, where the prototyping process is much different than the MVP process. Really, I mean, an MVP is really an experiment. And internally, you could make the argument that a prototype is also an experiment. It is. You're experimenting with your idea and trying to make different iterations of it. But the MVP is really the first chance for you to experiment with your customers and find out what's important to them. And where this started, this sort of rethinking this concept, I was listening to an interview a few weeks ago with Andy Katz-Mayfield and Jeff Rader, who are the founders of Harry's Razors. And most people are fairly familiar now with Harry's and Dollar Shave Club and how these two direct-to-customer D2C companies took on Gillette, which was really the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room as far as razor manufacturers are concerned. And in this interview, they were talking about what they had to go through to get to the point of producing a product that they could ship to customers. And there was sort of this perceived commoditization in the razor business where it looked like a commodity product that was really easy to make, that you could just churn these things out very quickly. And after the founders of Harry's got into this process further, they realized that making razor blades is not an easy process. There's a very fine line between making a sharp blade that's efficient, that works really well, and something that's actually going to hurt you, that damages your face somehow. And it's a very fine, refined process to try to machine this metal down to make a razor blade out of it. And as a result, one of the comments, I think it was Andy Katz-Mayfield, said in the interview, there really is no MVP in that space. There's no way that you can produce an MVP in that space. You have to commit. You have to commit to produce the product and put it in the warehouse or put it wherever you're going to keep it, and then be ready to ship it. And that's one of the risks among the many risks of starting a business ventures. When you get into that sort of space, you have to make that commitment. There's really no time to experiment.
Yeah, no time. And probably also it's a very complex process to set it up, right? In order to get that particular sharpness and not opening up your face. That's probably a machine that really needs it needs to be a production line that really needs to be set up. So it's very hard to use just a couple.
They found a company in Germany that was willing to produce for them after some negotiation, and they knew the process, so they had the process down pat, and they were able to go through that process and make the quality that they were seeking. And that's what one of the big differentiations was, not only the D2C concept of selling direct to the consumer through sort of a subscription / mail order model, but it was also the high quality that they were trying to differentiate themselves in. Again, what's sort of a perceptive commodity, it's really not as much of a commodity. There are some distinctions, and it's a very difficult process, but there's sort of this perceived one size fits all when it comes to razor blades, that they're all the same. How do you differentiate that? You can. And that's one of the things that they went for.
Yeah. Yes. So there's a couple of situations where an MVP might not be the right thing to do, right? And one of them is that if it's very complex, if there's a lot of IP, there's a couple of things that, well, this might not be the suitable thing. What should be clear is to know what to expect, to get some certainty in the business model, right?
Right. And one of the hard things is when you have a space or an industry where the expectations of the customer are very, very clear. In other words, you have customers that have already committed very strongly to an idea of what something should look like, function like, processes that it goes through. That's a really tough space to do an MVP in, because again, an MVP is essentially an experiment. You sort of enter the MVP space not really knowing exactly what the customer wants. And so when you get into a space, and there are those spaces where people have a very strong feeling about what they want in a product or even a service, and those differentiators are very well defined among the customers, and that's a really hard space to do an MVP in. In other places where you see problems with MVP again is in, hardware based, where you're developing almost like a computer hardware based platform. That's not easy to do. That's really hard to MVP, to create an MVP around. You and I've had conversations before about biotech and pharma. There's a lot of IP in that space. Plus, there's a ton of regulation. So any industry that has a lot of regulatory hoops, if you will, to jump through, that's a really tough space. In the United States of America, you might invent a drug and it might take 5 years to get it through FDA approval and all the other things that you have to go through. And then not to mention the IP. And it's really hard to be able to do an MVP in that space because you can't hardly ask your customers to sign a non-disclosure agreement when you sell them a product. So the cat is going to be out of the bag, if you will, as the old cliche goes.
You can ask your investors probably, but you can't ask your customers.
But very hard.
The thing that stands out the most is to get clarity in your business model, to be sure about the expectations, to be sure about your customer base, to be sure about those things. And then an MVP might not be desirable, or it might not be possible. Right? If it's going to take you 5 years to get your license for a drug that you developed, you can't spread the word before that. You can't get it out into the market because, it's illegal. Right? So
it's hard to test. You can do trials medically and have people sign up to be willing to test the drug with you, but that's a very highly regulated process because let's face it, you could kill people depending on what the drug is that you're talking about, and obviously that's where the line gets crossed or cause significant health problems for somebody in that space. And it's really interesting. I talk a lot about with my students and in my articles and the things that I post on LinkedIn. I talk a lot about context. And we come up with these terms, or we hear these terms like business model canvases and lean startups and MVPs and all these different terms. And I don't use this word in necessarily a negative way, but these buzzwords that we hear, we hear these words out there a lot. And MVP is one of those words now where in some circles, if you actually say MVP or minimum viable product, people almost roll their eyes into their heads because they've heard it so many times before. But there's a lot of context there. And going back to what we talked about with the situational, looking at whether it fits in that situation, it's context. And I think a lot of young entrepreneurs are confused because they hear the term MVP and they think, oh, I need to come up with an MVP. I have to come up with an MVP. I think it's important to step back and analyze your business model first.
Yeah, definitely.
Take a look at what space you're in and try to figure out, is it appropriate for me to try to come up with an MVP?
Yeah. And also of these methods, I'm a big fan of lean startup, like the customer development process, effectual thinking. But the thing is that you should choose whichever is relevant for you and your particular situation. You don't need to use everything, right? Just like if you are thinking about enhancing your presence on social media, you're not going to do that on all platforms at the same time, right? You're going to do one thing, and that's where your attention is. Just like you choose or choose not to do an MVP or anything else, any experiment else, because there are so many different experiments that you can do. It's all about creating a certain certainty in your business model, not guessing so much anymore, but knowing about it. And then you can actually, launch your product and get a higher probability for a better success rate, really.
Well, there's a balance with that start mentality too. We've talked about books like Art of the Start and Just Start. And I think there was another title that you were mentioning to me and there is something to that. Metaphorically, again, we've talked about with my students, if you've got a big term paper that's due for class and you procrastinate it and you put it off and you put it off, sometimes the most liberating thing you can do is just write that first sentence.
Yeah. And
Just
whether it's good or bad, just get it out.
Just get it out there and just start.
Once you have the first sentence, once you take the first step, once you create your first social media post, the next one is going to, and I think you're a subject matter expert on that right now, Tom.
Well, I don't know about
that. It's getting easier, or
I'm
it's
still
getting
feeling
more.
around a lot,
There's
but yeah.
kind of a rhythm in it. So, and that's really what it is about. I think that's these things about just starting, just getting going. That's a thing that's a lot has to do with psychology, right? Most people just procrastinate a bit, are a bit hesitant. Our education system often emphasizes the perfect part. It should be perfect. It should be an A, a straight A. That's not the thing for entrepreneurship. It should be your best guess, right? You're not going to fail on purpose, but you might fail, right? You might fail on the way. You might fail your experiment, or you might fail an hypothesis on your business model, but you can get better. You can get up again and you can invent something better, a better experiment, or adjust your value proposition, or do something with it, right? So,
well, I think, again, we talk about perfection. Perfect is the enemy of done.
yeah.
And it's really hard when you try to strive for perfection all the time. It's hard to get done. And again, thinking about the MVP, I think that was one of the best things that it contributed to entrepreneurship. Is it convinced entrepreneurs, or at least some entrepreneurs, that you can prototype something to death. You can keep perfecting it and perfecting it and perfecting it. Sooner or later, you have to get something out there. And I've often had discussions with my students about the iPhone. When Apple introduced the iPhone in 2007, and contextually, this was probably about 5 years after it was introduced. And I don't know, maybe they're on iPhone number 5 or 6 or something like that. And I asked my students, could they have built this iPhone, the iPhone 5 or the iPhone 6, in 2007? And most of my students would nod their heads and say, yes, they could. The point is, they didn't have to. We just wanted an alternative to the old-fashioned flip phone or the BlackBerry. We wanted something that basically a handheld laptop, something we could surf the internet on and take advantage of a lot of extra technological capabilities that we weren't getting on our existing products. And that's exactly what Apple gave us. Now, they continued to iterate and improve it to this day. I mean, it gets a little bit better every single time they come out with a different version of it.
Definitely.
But they didn't have to give us that in the beginning, and they could have kept on perfecting it and making it better. And the other thing that is important to remember there too is apps were a big part, obviously, of the iPhone. A lot of those apps didn't exist in 2007 yet. They had development conferences and things like that surrounding the iPhone, but there was a lot of miles to go before the capabilities would be there that we see today. So,
and the maturity of the apps, and also the amount of apps. So and that's where the apps are really a big part of the value proposition of the iPhone. That's why you get the iPhone, because you can access all these apps. We know that nowadays, but back then, even the value proposition was good enough without all of the community of apps that we now see.
Right. I'm going to just offer a couple of examples that I use in class of MVPs, and then you've got some real life examples that you'd like to talk about, Inga. So one of my favorite examples of an MVP is Dropbox. For most people are familiar that Dropbox is really one of the first big cloud solutions that came along, where you didn't have to store things on a hard drive or a jump drive or email files back and forth to yourself if you wanted to work on something at home, a work file of some sort. So Dropbox came along and they took advantage of large scale servers and of the technology at the time, where you can have a one-stop shop to save your files to and access it from everywhere. New concept. Obviously, there's always a little bit of trepidation with new technologies like that, but they were trying to increase their usership. So instead of actually offering what most people would perceive to be a product, something you can take home with you, they put out a very simple 2-minute explainer video. It was a little animated, short 2-minute video that pretty much anybody could make with the technology that's available. They put it out on YouTube, just explaining what is Dropbox. Here's Dropbox. Here's what it does for you. Here are the advantages of using a cloud-based system like that. And their usership went from like 75,000 up to 2 million over about a 2 or 3 week period of time. So they had all those individuals commit to becoming a paid user of Dropbox or a signed up user of Dropbox.
Yeah.
And another great example that I use with students a lot too is Zappos. Zappos was, of course, meant to be the online Amazon of shoes. And ironically, they were purchased by Amazon eventually. But in the beginning, this was a big gamble because shoes are difficult, because you think of all the different sizes and all the different styles. You can fill up a pretty good warehouse space fairly quickly trying to stock all of the shoes that you think are popular. So what the founders of Zappos did was they threw up a very basic website. They listed a bunch of different styles of shoes on there at very competitive prices. And when they would sell a pair of these shoes, they would literally jump in their car, drive down to the local shoe store, buy the shoes, and then ship them to the customer.
Yep.
And most business-minded people, students and whatnot, would say, well, they're losing money on every single pair of shoes they sell by having to pay retail for them instead of wholesale. And that's true. But if you think of the gamble that they would have had to take by putting, say, 100,000 pairs of shoes in a warehouse or something like that, or $100,000 worth of shoes in a warehouse, that's a huge gamble. This is a way for them to test and experiment with their idea and prove product market fit and prove the validity of the overall idea without having to make that huge commitment of ordering all those shoe styles.
Mhm.
So those are two really neat examples of MVPs. And ironically, those came along before we ever started really using the term MVP. So there have been MVPs longer than there's actually been the term MVP.
Well, a lot longer, I'm sure. There must have been a lot of examples in the past, a lot further away also. It's only now that we start to conceptualize it, I feel. But yeah, just to come back to the Dropbox example, sometimes a good explanation and a good video makes such a difference. And it's really about proving the problem, right? Proving the problem,
Right.
proving the headache. Because if you can get to prove that, if you can get to prove the problem that people are experiencing, and you can prove that they're willing to pay or dedicate time or whatever it is that you want them to do, that is an MVP, because you just proved your business model, you proved your product market fit, right? You prove that these people are experiencing this headache and that they are willing to actually do something about it. And that's the case with Zappos. I think that they were not out for any profitability at that point.
Right.
They were losing money on every sale, but they got to prove that people are willing to pay for shoes to receive them at their home, which was something big, right? Because a lot of people wanted to go to a store, feel the shoes, walk a little bit on the shoes, and then take them home.
Well,
and Zappos turned it around.
Right. And the Zappos thing, the other thing about Zappos to remember is how many businesses, with the exception of a franchise perhaps, make money their first year anyway. And they were incrementally losing little bits of money on each pair of shoes that they sold, but they also weren't tying up hundreds of thousands of dollars or whatever, putting inventory on the shelf that they weren't necessarily going to sell. I want to say hello to Hussein and Neil that checked in on chat, and Neil had a question. Why don't people get to the MVP quicker? Ingo, why do you think people don't move towards the MVP faster? Is it sort of that analysis paralysis we talked about before?
I think so. I guess so, that they don't get to sometimes they're just hesitant. Now Neil is saying most people get distracted looking like a business. Trying to look successful, right? The Facebook
Everybody
Live,
wants to look
all
like a
the travel
company,
pics.
right?
Everybody wants to look good on
Right.
social media.
I think
Um,
there's something to that, Neil. Absolutely. I mean, you hear people say that all the time. I started a business, and I don't like to say this back to them, but a lot of times I want to say, no, you didn't. Not yet. You're not a business yet. You're still sort of flailing around trying to learn how to swim. And the MVP I think makes entrepreneurs nervous, because I think it makes them feel less sophisticated. Because there's this concept where you sort of, you hang that shingle out and you put up that nice shiny sign out front and you're in business. And a lot of us aren't in business, even though we'd like to be. And I think that's one of the reasons why the MVP gets a little bit sidelined, if you will, because I think I think some entrepreneurs feel like it makes them look unsophisticated. I don't know.
yeah,
You agree with me, Inga?
actually, putting something out there, and I think there's a lot of that hesitant type of mindset of not offering something that's perfect. That's a lot of it. And once you get something out, well, then you can build upon that. But that's like the big value of that movement of just start and getting started, and all the theories that are coming up about just launching.
Right.
It's not about throwing something mediocre together and then just getting it out. It's about having your best guess, doing it well, not perfect, but well, and then getting feedback on it.
Minimum feature set, as Steve Blank
Yeah.
likes to say. You have
Yes.
some real examples of this,
Yes.
Inga. Why don't you share with us what you have?
Yeah. We were just talking about prototyping and MVPs and the difference on both. Sometimes they also flow over to each other. So I just because I've got this process of the playground documented, I wanted to kind of show that cycle, show that process to you, because it's not a one-time thing. It's not a theater and the curtains open and ta-da, there's the big thing. It is really about a process, and the first uh, prototypes. I am just going to share my screen with you now. The first prototypes, the first sketches, the first things that I did in that case workshops on was this, right? So it wasn't even a game yet. It was just something that was supposed to help entrepreneurs to uh, get some theory, some framework, just to receive, to kind of get some progress without necessarily a mentor there. So something that could give them something to hold on to kind of use in order to progress and advance their ideas by themselves. So that was really based on the senses. So after testing that in workshops with experts, with well, possible kind of customers, getting some feedback on it, this happened. So this is already a bit more streamlined. It looks like a canvas. I never wanted to call it a canvas because there are so many people with the canvas, and I didn't want to be another one. So
Right.
this was the next phase of it. And then we had kind of a dynamic with this traffic light, so you could kind of color all of these boxes. So if you would be red on the ear, then you would still have a lot of work on that. If you would be green, then you had listened to your customers a lot. So we had the traffic light thing going on there. And then I was looking for something more interactive, more engaging, and more, well, playful, in a sense that you get more innovative ideas, different ideas. You can really work on your challenges. That's when the game came up. As you can see, this is kind of a game of the goose. So there's like 2 cycles of it. This is still in Spanish also. And This was kind of a game of the goose, but very soon you find out that the game of the goose is very random and not so much based on people's own projects and their own ideas. So we kind of let that idea go, and then this happened. So this already looks like the game itself, in the sense that it has all the questions. It has the 4 areas of the game, but this is something I just put together myself, right?
Mhm.
Until now, we've had only prototypes, so thoughts sketched out on paper, really, whether it's digital or just I made some drawings also. Don't have pictures of those, unfortunately, but it was an interesting process. So and that's when we really designed it. So this is the physical version, this is the online version. And then we could actually, as soon as we had the online version of it with the real design, we could actually start to show it to people to get some feedback. Let's go back to the other screen.
So your product, your game is one of those spaces that's maybe a little bit more challenging to do an MVP in. You can offer some online examples.
Yes.
But it's a lot harder from a manufacturing perspective. Once you commit to graphics and all the different things that you commit to, it's a lot more difficult to just change course very quickly with it. You and I've talked about that.
You need to print, right? At a certain point, you need to print.
Right.
So this was the online version. This is the physical version, and I would call this the MVP, actually, because we've had this made. I've sent it out, and people paid for it.
Mhm.
That's proof that somebody is actually paying for it. That's the MVP version. This is still not the final product. I've had 20 of these made, right? So a couple of people paid for it to use it. They've received it and they are using it still. But that would be the MVP at this moment. Now, especially with a product like this, like these questions, you can edit them eternally. Something else will come up and something will need editing, right? It's an eternal process. So that's where a lot of the changes towards the next version, like this is the box to it.
Mhm.
Like this still had a white box. We just had these boards made with the tiles and everything, but we had a white box just because we didn't have a design for it at the moment. And well, then we've got this box. We found out that actually the tiles are more practical to play because people will pick them up and read them like this. They will read the tile. So we didn't need to print this on the board.
Mhm.
So there was another couple of things that have changed in order to get to the final product. Would I say it is perfect? No, it's not perfect. There's always, and especially editing, is an eternal process. There will always be a sentence that can be formulated better.
Right.
But but at a certain point, you need to take that decision, right? At a certain point, you need to go out there and you need to have proven that people are willing to pay for it, which is the thing that this MVP has the opportunity, this MVP has given in order to say, well, there's enough people here that I can attend. I can add other people later on.
Right.
But this is something that's printable, it's sellable, people are willing to pay for it. We can do a training with it. We can work with it and it's cool, right?
You've achieved some level of proof of concept with that.
Yeah.
And again, proof of concept, I want to emphasize, is not a dust your hands off and walk away. There's many companies out there that have achieved proof of concept that have to go back and constantly revisit that proof of concept because customers are a fickle lot. They're a very, very harsh group of judges of our products and services, and they will change their mind and they will go other directions very quickly if we don't revisit. I mean, you even look at an iconic board game like Monopoly that's been around since the 1930s. And they haven't made huge changes in that game, but they have made changes. They've changed, the pieces that you move around and different little things about the game to sort of keep people's interest generated
Yeah.
In getting new users.
There will always be a different dynamic, something else to experiment with. There will always be, like, I imagine there's a lot of just updating also in a game like
Right.
Monopoly, right? So $1 in the 1930s is not the same as $1 now. So people need to kind of relate to it,
Mm-hmm.
right? You can't buy a house for $5.
Right.
Maybe you could in the 1930s.
Right.
So so you need to update, right? It's
For sure.
never finished, and as soon as you think it's finished, that's a mistake to think
Right.
that something is finished. Yeah.
Good. Well, we've
Cool.
gone over time again.
Yeah. A little bit. Well, I guess
That's
that's a
all
good
right.
sign. So it was great to see you all. If you haven't, please connect with Tom's community. He's written some very interesting articles, and now we're doing this podcast also, or webcast, I should say. And please connect with me to know more about the playground and how to use it for education and coaching of entrepreneurs. And it was a joy to see you today and to
Yes, it
speak
was.
with you,
Thank you
Tom.
for joining us, taking time out of your day to do this.
Great. So see you next time.
Take
Have
care.
a great day. Bye-bye.